test for eyeline. It's just a test for eyeline, looking at the CG and up at the lens. Hello and welcome, hello and welcome, 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 welcome. And up at the lens. District WPBA 30 and 91.1 Atlanta. I'm Dennis O'Hare, locals, morning edition. And up at the lens. And down. 1, 2, 3 early voting districts. 6th congressional district includes some of Atlanta's northern and northeastern suburbs, covers parts of blah, 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 blah. Okay? Suburbs and covers parts of Cobb, Fulton, and DeKalb counties. Good? Okay.
and welcome to the Georgia 6th Congressional District Debate on PBA 30 and 90.1 WABE Atlanta. I'm Dennis O'Hare, the host of Morning Edition on WABE. Early voting is already underway in the 6th District. Election Day is June 20th. Now, the 6th Congressional District includes some of Atlanta's northern and northeastern suburbs and covers parts of Cobb, Fulton, and DeKalb counties. The winner of the runoff will succeed Republican Tom Price, who resigned when President Donald Trump appointed him as the nation's Secretary of Health and Human Services. Now, the runoff winner will finish Congressman Price's term, and then an election for a full term will take place in November of next year. We are honored to have the two candidates with us for the next hour. Republican Karen Handel is a former Georgia Secretary of State and former chair of the Fulton County Commission. Democrat Jon Ossoff is a former congressional aide. He's an investigative filmmaker. And we are also joined by a small studio audience, and we are insisting on silence from them, with two exceptions, at the end of the debate and now. Please welcome and thank our candidates. Now, for the next hour, we'll have a conversation on some of the major issues facing the country. I can promise you in advance we won't get to all of them. Sections will be devoted to health care, the economy, well, health care first, and then the economy, jobs, and the budget, then foreign policy, and then other domestic issues. After 1-minute opening statements, each candidate is going to have 2 minutes to answer initial questions and follow-ups with me. And then they will have 30 seconds each or to a minute to exchange responses to what each other has said. And by coin toss, it was determined that Karen Handel will make the first opening statement. Secretary Handel.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sponsoring this debate and having us both here. I am an extremely unlikely candidate for Congress. I left home when I was just 17, finished up high school, and went to work. I know exactly what it is like to fight against the odds and to overcome adversity. I started my career in an entry-level job. I worked really hard to move up and excel and prosper, ultimately holding executive positions in several companies, running the Chamber of Commerce in North Fulton, having the privilege of serving as County Commission Chairman and then as Secretary of State. I'm tough, I'm resilient. Some people call me scrappy, and that's because I am. I am determined to get the job done, and I will take that tenacity, that type of determination to Congress to represent the people of the 6th District in the fiercest possible way that I can. So I look forward to answering the questions today, sharing my experience and how I am the better candidate for this job. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary Handel. Mr. Ossoff.
Thank you, Dennis, for moderating. Thanks to Georgia Public Broadcasting. Thank you, Secretary Handel, for being here. We have virtually unlimited economic potential here in Metro Atlanta. We have a growing high-tech sector, medical research and biotech sectors, a growing financial technology sector, all of the assets necessary to become one of the world's great commercial capitals. In this region, we have the busiest airport in the world. We're just up the road from a deep water port in Savannah. We're becoming a hub for logistics in the global economy, and we can become that great commercial capital, and with it, bring greater opportunity to families and households here, bring more capital and clients to businesses and entrepreneurs. But we need some imagination to get that done. We need some fresh leadership that's ready to work across the aisle, to cut wasteful spending, to set the right priorities like infrastructure, high-tech research, higher education. With some fresh leadership, we can achieve our full economic potential. And I'm ready to go to Washington to work across the aisle to focus on solutions so that we can become what we have the potential to become, and we can all have a higher quality of life.
Thank you very much. Now we get to our questions, and once again, each candidate will have 2 minutes, basically exchanging thoughts with me, and then they'll have a chance to respond to each other. And you don't have to take the whole 2 minutes if you don't want to. We can move on to other things too. By coin toss, Mr. Ossoff gets the first question. And Mr. Ossoff, you've talked about fixing the Affordable Care Act instead of scrapping it, and that's how we'll begin this section on health care. And one of the biggest problems with Obamacare has been a much sharper than expected increase in premiums that people have to pay. Now, it can vary. We won't get into all the variables, but here in the Atlanta area, the average annual jump in premiums in the last 3 years for a 40-year-old on the silver plan, just to take a hypothetical, has been 5%. It's an annual jump of 5% according to Georgia State University analysis. But in other places like Gainesville, Northeast Georgia, it's 22% a year. Now, the House Republican plan that passed the House and is now in the Senate would let states get waivers so that people could buy plans without some of the coverage that's now mandated under Obamacare. The Congressional Budget Office score of that estimates that, depending on what a state does with its waivers, average premiums could eventually end up anywhere from 4% lower to 26% lower in 10 years than they would be if we kept Obamacare. So doesn't that potentially address the problems of uninsured people and the high premiums? And given that, isn't that a fix for Obamacare?
Well, what we need is bipartisan efforts to get premiums under control. I think we can do that by introducing more competition into the insurance market, something for which I think there may be bipartisan will on both sides of the aisle, letting Georgians shop plans across state lines. And like in any market, if consumers have more choices, then prices will be driven down and quality will be driven up. But what the House Health Care Bill does, and Secretary Handel supports the House Health Care Bill, is not only throw more than 20 million Americans off their health insurance, but it guts essential protections for Georgians with pre-existing conditions. And there are more than 328,000 Georgians with pre-existing conditions in the 6th District alone.
But if
I mentioned the other night.
If people can get coverage, especially young people, could get coverage for just the conditions they might need, wouldn't that actually mean more people insured?
I oppose legislation that guts protections for Georgians with pre-existing conditions. I mentioned the other night, Dennis, a young man I met named Matt, who's 7 years old. He has a heart condition, a pre-existing condition, and without the protections for Georgians with pre-existing conditions like Matt, his family could have to pay tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars per year in order to keep their son alive, out of pocket. Let me mention another story. A young man named John Armwood. John Armwood was between jobs when he developed cancer. And because there are protections for Georgians with pre-existing conditions, John was able to get the insurance he needed and his cancer was cured. Secretary Handel supports a bill that guts protections for Georgians with pre-existing conditions. And with all due respect, Secretary Handel, when we discussed this the other evening, you were misinformed about that. This bill guts those protections for Georgians with pre-existing conditions. And it's consistent, I think, with Secretary Handel's record of imposing her own views on Georgians' health care choices. And we discussed the other evening how when Secretary Handel was an executive at the Komen Foundation, she saw fit to do it in that capacity.
We'll pick up on that part of things in just a moment, but let me just ask you really quickly. If you win, you'll be joining a House caucus where some members, along with some in the Senate, are saying the answers to these problems that you're referring to or that the Republicans are referring to with the system is to move to a single-payer system along the lines of Medicare or some of the national insurance programs in other Western nations. Would you favor that?
I think we need a lot less ideology around healthcare and a lot more of a focus on how we can make progress on a bipartisan basis. I don't think a plan like that has any hope of passing this Congress. The only way that we're going to get anything done on healthcare is with a bipartisan approach. And I think that by increasing competition in the health insurance market, we should be able to build bipartisan goodwill to do that. I will be the kind of independent voice ready to work across the aisle to achieve that kind of result for Georgians.
Thanks very much. Secretary Handel, on the same subject, and Mr. Ossoff actually referred to this, the Congressional Budget Office score of the Republican plan projects that 23 million more Americans will go uninsured in the next 10 years. And Bill Custer, who analyzes health policy at Georgia State, estimates 700,000 Georgians, we're talking about just Georgians here, would lose coverage over the next decade. But there's another problem. While premiums would drop for some people, and I referred to that with Mr. Ossoff, others could become uninsured by just being priced out. The CBO said over time it would become more difficult for less healthy people, including people with pre-existing medical conditions in states that get waivers, to purchase insurance because the premiums would just go up so sharply. So that leads to the question we actually got from someone in our audience. And this person asked, how are you going to make sure that my son with a pre-existing congenital condition would be able to afford insurance as he turns 26 and ages out of the coverage he has through me?
First of all, the status quo on Obamacare is unacceptable. This is a system that is collapsing in on itself. We talk about skyrocketing premiums and what might happen post a repeal and replace. Ladies and gentlemen, premiums are already pricing people out of plans. That is a fact. For my husband and I know what I'm talking about, because Steve and I get our insurance off of the Obamacare exchange. We have seen our personal premiums go from $300 to almost $1,200 a month. Meanwhile, our deductible went from $2,500 to $10,000. People are already being priced out. The status quo cannot continue. What
But
we need.
the CBO says, under the Republican
Hang on
plan
a second.
as it exists.
That assumes that not a single solitary person currently on the exchange is going to take advantage of the tax credits that are given to individuals who want to buy a plan. What this does is provide tax credits. It gets the federal government out of the way. That is going to create more plan options, more doctor choices, and bring down the premiums. It is incorrect. The CBO projected great numbers for Obamacare, and they did not come through at all. We need to have more choice, get the federal government out of the way, and if I can, on pre-existing conditions. With all due respect, John, you are simply factually incorrect. Factually incorrect. I have great empathy on the pre-existing condition issue. My sister was born without an esophagus. She is the very definition of that. And for individuals who currently have plans, they cannot be denied, they cannot be charged more. There are already individuals who are with pre-existing conditions that are being priced out of the market. So what is being accomplished? Nothing. We have to repeal this bill and replace it with the new fix that's coming through that takes out those incredible tax increases and restores back to the people their health care decisions at a rate that they can afford.
Just a couple seconds left, and then we'll get to Mr. Ossoff. Just to note on what on whether the CBO underestimated what the impacts would be of Obamacare. Both CNN and our colleagues at NPR did a fact check on that, and it is true the CBO overestimated the number of people who would gain coverage through the exchanges, but they were much closer to the mark on a lot of other things about it, including how much the ACA would affect coverage overall. So it was kind of a mixed record on that, and they also found
But it doesn't take away from the fact that their main projection was incorrect, Dennis.
But many of their others have been, and that was just a note there. Mr. Ossoff, you wanted to respond to something Secretary Handel said, and then you'll have a chance to do the same.
Well, just on the matter of pre-existing conditions, and Secretary Handel, I appreciate you sharing your personal story. And, you know, the facts are the facts. And independent fact checks, journalists, analysts have all found that this bill guts protections for Georgians with pre-existing conditions. It's fine to say, Madam Secretary, that someone cannot be denied coverage, period, if they have a pre-existing condition. But if there's no limit on price discrimination and the plan is unaffordable, that is a useless protection. And it is a fact that this bill guts protections against massive price hikes for Georgians with pre-existing conditions. And it is important that the voters be well informed about this. And frankly, it's important that candidates for Congress be well informed about this. Secretary Handel's position is incorrect. It's factually incorrect. This bill will not serve Georgians with pre-existing conditions, more than 328,000 of them in the 6th District. And for that reason, it's unacceptable.
Secretary Handel.
Thank you. I guess, John, you subscribe to the Nancy Pelosi approach to policymaking. Just pass it and then you'll read it. I've looked at the bill. It specifically says that individuals who have a plan, as we transition to the new plan and more market approach in the states, that you cannot be denied a plan and you cannot be charged more because of a pre-existing condition. So I think it is really important for everyone to understand that the system we currently have is collapsing. The status quo, doing nothing, is unacceptable. We are down to just 2 providers in the state of Georgia. That is not choice. And those premiums are going through the roof. They're already pricing people out of the market.
Let me quickly pick up, because we've got about a minute left to cover the rest of health care. But you just touched on something, Secretary Handel, that's really important about insurance. And I'm going to toss this one to you first and then Mr. Osa. The deadline for insurance companies to file their Obamacare marketplace plans is the day after one of you will be elected, right after the runoff election. So if the Trump administration decides to cut the subsidies to insurers that are called cost-sharing reductions, and it gets very weedy here, but insurance companies, if they don't know what their subsidies are going to be, they will pull out of the exchanges. We've already seen this happen in Ohio. So do you think that the administration and Health and Human Services Secretary Price should at least figure out how to continue the marketplace, since the Senate hasn't even agreed on what its version of the bill is, at least give the insurance companies some certainty. Say we're going to continue Obamacare the way it is until we agree on what repeal and replace should be. And we got about 30 seconds for
Thank
each
you.
of you.
Well, as someone who has real-world business experience, I completely understand the requirement to have a transition period. I don't think anyone is suggesting, certainly not Secretary Price, that this would change from Friday to Monday. There will have to be a transition period, and that is really important for the insurers, for physicians, and frankly for patients and those who are out shopping plans. So without question, a transition.
Mr. Ossoff.
Well, there's no doubt that the laws on the books need a lot of improvement. And it's important that the federal agencies work to make sure that these adjustments aren't disruptive and don't deny people the health insurance that they need. But what we need is a bipartisan approach to this issue that will increase competition in the insurance market while strengthening essential consumer protections. And Secretary Handel's insistence to the contrary notwithstanding, it is a fact that this bill is bad for Georgians with pre-existing conditions. Voters need to know that, and candidates need to know that too.
Thank you very much. We're going to move on to the economy. We may come back to some of the things that we talked about later on, and certainly you'll have time in your closing statements to make any points that you felt you didn't have time to. We'll start with Secretary Handel on this one. The president's budget that he submitted is based on the assumption that the economy is going to grow at an annual rate of about 3% by 2020 and stay there. In other words, continued 3% annual growth. Now, a lot of economists say this is unrealistic. Won't this add to the deficit if the projections are wrong, if the president's math is wrong? Won't this actually add to the deficit and to something that a lot of your Republican colleagues in Georgia are concerned about, including Senator David Perdue, the long-term debt, which is now $550 billion?
Well, I think a couple of things. First, on the president actually submitting a budget, that's something that hasn't happened certainly under the 8 years of Obama, and it is one that does balance in 10 years. To be sure, we have serious budget issues that require our attention and some tough decisions. At the same time, we're not going to cut our way out of things. So that budget was presented with also a parallel to do tax reform, roll back mandates, roll back regulation that is
But in the
crushing
short
things.
term, that would cut revenues even more. I mean,
But
the
you're looking
effects-
at a 10-year horizon. The budget was built out on a 10-year horizon, which I think is very important. Ladies and gentlemen, having a growth rate in this, having an economic rate of 1.5% growth in our economy is nothing short but of anemic. We have to move that needle up to 3%. And I believe, unlike my opponent who refuses to commit to tax reductions and tax cuts, that if we reduce corporate rates and individual rates, we will start to spur real economic growth so that we can get the economy moving up into the 3% range, if not higher. I believe that is imperative. And couple that with regulatory reform as well as rolling back some of the onerous mandates that are literally strangling small businesses, the companies that are the largest creators of jobs, not only in 6th District, but in the country.
But last year, growth was at 1.6%. Are you saying we could double that in that short a time?
In 10 years, we better, or we have much bigger issues on the horizon. I believe very deeply that when you combine tax cuts for corporations and individuals, and the individual component of this is key for this reason. So many businesses in the 6th and in the country are organized as LLCs and S-corps. So those are what we call the pass-through companies. And we must do it on the individual side so that the middle class can participate and those LLC and S-corp businesses can participate. That's how we really get this economy going, because if we don't include that segment of the economy, middle class and small businesses, we won't achieve it.
Mr. Ossoff, you've talked about cutting wasteful spending. It's a prominent part of your website, of your ads. You've said you've identified $600 billion in potential savings, but over what period of time, and to Secretary Handel's point, can we cut our way out of this? Just about every economist on, no matter where they are in the spectrum, have said, yeah, we have to cut wasteful spending, but there's no way we can cut our way to budget stability.
Well, first of all, to ensure that the record is accurate, Secretary Handel, in fact, I've been advocating for reductions in corporate income tax rates for small and medium-sized businesses. I think that would be a big win for our business community here in Georgia. And unlike Secretary Handel, I've identified specific cuts and savings, $600 billion over 10 years, and $16 billion immediately, in order to reduce the deficit and create space for us to set the right priorities: higher education, infrastructure, high-tech research, which we need to grow our local economy here. It's important that candidates for Congress understand the facts. And the budget proposal we've been talking about has been widely panned by independent economists because of its unrealistic growth expectations, and because it presumes that the tax reform plan, which so far amounts to little more than some bullet points on a single sheet of paper, is deficit neutral. But it has not been assessed by independent economists for its impact on the deficit either, and yet Secretary Handel supports it. She supports a health care bill, and she's wrong about what's in that as well.
But can you address that long-term debt especially, and those deficits, without looking at the revenue side? You have talked about tax cuts for small and medium-sized businesses, but if you win, you're going to join a House Democratic caucus where many members have called for increasing individual income taxes on folks in the top income brackets. Now, according to the Census Bureau, the median household income in the 6th District in 2015 was nearly $83,900. So that would certainly affect some of those folks. Would you support a higher tax rate for upper income Americans, as many Democrats in the House do?
No. I don't support any increase in income tax rates. What I support is a serious approach to tackling wasteful spending, and then setting the right priorities like infrastructure, high-tech research, and higher education. Secretary Handel has not specified any cuts, whereas I have, which is pretty unusual for a candidate for Congress, specified $600 billion in cuts over 10 years. I think that speaks to the kind of independent-minded leadership we need to work across the aisle to attack waste. And by the way, folks know this, both parties in Washington are complicit in wasting huge amounts of taxpayer dollars. The problem is career politicians. And if we send another career politician like Secretary Handel to Washington, we're going to get more of the same. You elect more of the same, you get more of the same. We need a fresh perspective that'll take tackling waste seriously.
Thank you. That's your 2 minutes. Secretary
Thank
Handel,
you.
we got
Thank
rebuttal
you.
time. Yeah.
Thank you very much. My opponent talks a lot about cutting spending. He talks about balancing budgets. He has not done it one single time. He was a junior staffer for Hank Johnson, one of the most liberal tax and spend members of Congress that we have. I have a track record of cutting spending and balancing budgets. In Fulton County, I took on a $100 million budget deficit. I worked in a bipartisan fashion to stave off a massive property tax increase for the people of Fulton County and get that budget balanced. As Secretary of State, I cut that budget by nearly 20% as well. That's a kind of real-world experience. We cannot just sit around and talk about this, that, and the other, of which what John has proposed is essentially just a gnat in the grand scheme of the big budget. What needs to happen is fundamental budget reform. We need to move to zero-based budgeting. We need to break down the silos in the federal government and break down the bureaucrat speak where they talk about, oh, if I don't get the same amount of money I got last year, that's a cut. And that's the kind of talk that comes out of the liberals that Jon Ossoff is being propped up by and supported by. We need experience, someone who really knows how to deal with a budget.
Mr. Ossoff, you got about 30 seconds here, too.
Well, only a big spending career politician like Secretary Handel would refer to $600 billion as a drop in the bucket. That is $600 billion
In terms of
hard-earned-
balancing
excuse
this
me,
budget
Secretary
and
Handel, if I
dealing with
might.
a $20 trillion deficit,
If I might.
debt, it is.
And with all due respect, Secretary Handel, you don't have a lot of credibility on fiscal responsibility. When Secretary Handel was the chair of the Fulton County Commission, she plundered the county's cash reserves to balance the budget. In fact, was found just a couple of months ago telling half-truths about it. At the same time, grew her own office budget by more than 40%. What we need is a fresh perspective. Career politicians on both sides of the aisle, Dennis, have been wasting taxpayer dollars for too long.
All right, Secretary Handel, a
Wow.
couple seconds. here.
John, unbelievable. You continue to mislead and lie to the voters. I have one of the strongest fiscal records of any individual who has held public office in the state of Georgia. Balancing that budget at Fulton County by having targeted cuts, realigning that budget, prioritizing spending. And as Secretary of State, I cut that budget by nearly 20%. And my record speaks for itself. You have a record of working for one of the most liberal members of Congress. Your track record, your experience amounts to being a junior staffer for Hank Johnson and producing a couple of documentaries.
Okay, about 15 seconds, and then we're going to have to move on.
Well, the facts are the facts once again. And when Secretary Handel was the chair of the Fulton County Commission, she plundered the county's cash reserves to balance the budget, was found telling half-truths about it by an independent fact check a couple of months ago,
Okay, 10
and
seconds
has
for
very
you, and
little
then we're-
credibility on
10
fiscal
seconds for you, and then we're
responsibility.
going.
Thank you so much. When I left as Fulton County Commission Chairman, finishing up my term as chairman, Fulton County had the highest cash reserves in the recorded history of Fulton County, John.
All right.
You are the one who needs to get your facts straight.
At that point, we're going to, this could go on for the entire time, but we will have to move on here. And if you've just joined us, this is Georgia's 6th Congressional District debate on PBA 30 and on 90.1 WABE. I'm Dennis O'Hare, and we are joined by the two candidates in the June 20th runoff election, Republican Karen Handel and Democrat Jon Ossoff. Let's talk about President Trump and the Russia investigation for a moment. And for our audience, by the way, if you are watching or listening after Thursday morning, we are speaking just moments before fired FBI Director James Comey speaks to the Senate Intelligence Committee. But we did at least see the opening statement in advance in which he said in a series of meetings, the president asked him to back off the investigation of former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and asked for what amounted to a loyalty pledge. Secretary Handel, starting with you, do you think the president obstructed justice?
Based on that testimony, I don't think we can know one way or the other. We don't know what former FBI Director Comey is actually going to say today in front of the committee. What I think is the responsible thing to do here is let the 4 investigations proceed. We have a special counsel, we have the Senate, the House, as well as the Justice Department investigation. And it is imperative that we get to the facts of this situation
Are you
and let the facts really drive where we go and what action we take, not innuendo and all
Well,
of those things that have been in the press.
we-
So I'll be anxious to see what he actually testifies to
Is
and the
what's hap-
Q&A.
I'm sorry. Is what's happening more than innuendo, at least some of the things? I mean, we have already seen the president fire James Comey,
And Comey should have been fired.
but then he told Lester Holt that the Russia investigation had something to do with it. The White House has not said that, had denied the Washington Post report that the president approached top intelligence officials who testified yesterday as we speak, that went before that very same Senate Intelligence Committee. So do you see anything wrong here? I mean, someone might say, look, if a Democratic president had done this, it's not much of a stretch to believe that Republicans would be holding hearings that would make Benghazi look like nothing.
Well, what I have said, I continue to believe. There is enough here. That's why we have to have this investigation. And I'm not going to get into the speculatory realm of this. I want to see the actual facts. And the American people have a right and deserve to know what actually happened. Let's let the investigations go, get the facts. And I hope that everyone who is called to testify, that they actually show up and they tell truthfully and forthright, with a forthright manner, everything that they know.
The president campaigned for you. Did he mention anything about loyalty or any of the things that Mr. Comey is
Yes,
supposed to
primarily
say?
what was happening in the race.
Do you think that, I mean, do you have any second thoughts about him campaigning for you, given what has happened?
Look, we have an investigation going on in this. Let's let the facts go where they need to go on this. President Trump is the president, and having his support, I'm happy to have his support, but I'm also happy to have, frankly, the support of the people of the 6th District. That is what is most important to me, because as the next congressman for the 6th District, I understand full well that I am not an extension of the White House. I am an extension of the people of the 6th District.
Mr. Ossoff, on the same subject, I mean, for all of the questionable things, some of which I just cited to Secretary Handel, there is still no concrete evidence now, of any collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians, let alone the president or the president-elect as he was at the time. And this brings up a question, another one from our audience. What congressional oversight is needed on Russian election interference and any Trump campaign ties? And if you were in Congress, would you join some of your Democratic colleagues, a few, who are already demanding impeachment?
Well, Dennis, here's what we know. The U.S. intelligence community has publicly stated that the Russian government sought to interfere in the U.S. presidential election, and that they did so through their intelligence services on the direct orders of Vladimir Putin. And that is an outrage. No matter your party, as a matter of national security, as a matter of patriotism, a foreign intelligence service interfering in the U.S. presidential election requires a firm and tough response, and it requires a complete, independent, and transparent investigation. And that's what we need. I've been calling for an independent investigation for a long time, along with independent-minded leaders on both sides of the aisle. Senator John McCain has been calling for an independent investigation for months. Secretary Handel was silent on the subject, didn't call for an independent investigation until former FBI Director Mueller had already been appointed. And what we need is effective congressional oversight, not partisan congressional oversight. When matters so serious as a foreign intelligence service interfering in the U.S. presidential election come to light, we need folks in both parties to be aggressively seeking the facts so the American people know what happened.
So if you were in Congress, and this may come up, should you win, should Congress pass a bill putting the existing sanctions against Russia into law? In other words, have congressional imprimatur on it because of their behavior in Syria and because of the interference in the election?
Absolutely. We need a tough and firm response to Russian meddling in our politics, and it shouldn't be a matter of partisanship. And Secretary Handel refused to call for an independent investigation until Director Mueller had already been appointed because it was politically sensitive. I don't think these issues need to be judged on the politics or whether it's a partisan issue. We're talking about a foreign government interfering in a U.S. election. And career politicians, with all due respect, Dennis, career politicians on both sides of the aisle have made congressional oversight into a partisan matter. That's why we need independent leadership.
But quick yes or no, and you told me a few weeks ago you weren't there yet on impeachment. Is that still the case?
We're still not there yet. Okay. We need the facts, but we need congressional overseers to go after the facts aggressively, and we need a transparent investigation by Director Mueller.
Secretary Handel, 30 seconds to respond.
The independent, transparent investigation is underway. Going around and calling for things on the campaign trail is nothing but a bunch of platitudes, with all due respect. So we have 4 different investigations that are underway. It is imperative that we get to the bottom of exactly what happened with facts, not with anonymous leaks and sources, and certainly not with innuendo, with real facts, so that then we can take whatever action, as tough as is needed under the circumstances of what actually occurred.
And as Mr. Ossoff said, he's not there yet. If, and we won't go through any hypotheticals here, but is impeachment something that is off the table for you should the facts show the president obstructed justice?
I will look at the facts and let the facts take us to where the appropriate action should be.
Okay. Moving on, we're going to go to some foreign policy questions now, and if you've just joined us, this is the 6th congressional debate on 90.1 WABE and on PBA 30. I'm Dennis O'Hare, and we are joined by the two candidates in the June 20th runoff election, Democrat Jon Ossoff and Republican Karen Handel. Mr. Ossoff, I'm going to start with you on some foreign policy questions here, and this is about the Iran nuclear deal. And you have said, in fact said fairly recently, that you would want to make sure that we are able to have snapback sanctions, was I believe your word, if our intelligence shows that Iran is cheating on that nuclear deal. But you did not support just tearing it up as the president has said he would do, although he hasn't yet. But how can you be sure that our intelligence, good as it is, would be able to catch that?
Well, Dennis, our intelligence community and inspectors of the International Atomic Energy Agency do have the capability to assess whether or not Iran is in compliance with the deal. And my argument is that we need strict, uncompromising monitoring of Iran's compliance with its obligations to restrict uranium enrichment, that sanctions should snap back in the event they're in violation. And furthermore, we should be prepared to impose additional sanctions if Iran continues to test ballistic missiles in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. But Secretary Handel sees fit to shred the agreement, and in so doing, put Iran back on the path to a nuclear weapons capability, releasing them from their obligations to restrict enrichment. We need a tough and firm approach when it comes to Iran. They are a major state sponsor of terrorism. They are a major threat to our ally Israel, and we need to make sure that they're living up to their obligations.
But they have a history of violating agreements in the past. So do you support continued suspension of the sanctions for now?
That's why we need strict, uncompromising monitoring. And in the event Iran violates
And you're
its
saying we
obligations,
could get that?
Absolutely. Our intelligence community and the International Atomic Energy Agency have that capability. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence and Senator Bob Corker, Republican of Tennessee on the Foreign Affairs Committee on the Senate side, have both said that Iran is in compliance. And if they violate the deal, sanctions should snap back immediately.
Secretary Handel, you have said, look, they are violating the deal and we need to tear it up. How do you know they're not complying? What evidence do you have, especially given the last few moments of what Mr. Ossoff said, that even Republicans and even Secretary Tillerson has said, for now, they're complying?
It has been reported, and like John, we only know, John, what we can read in the newspapers, and we don't have any inside sources on this. But from the things that I have seen, they are already and have violated the terms of the deal. That is the reason that there is a bill working its way through the United States Senate now to enhance and increase and put in place stricter sanctions against Iran. I think that has to happen. Having a bad deal, which it was a bad deal. Let's be honest. Obama put the deal in place on his way out, took billions of dollars in cash over there to Iran, and their own people admitted that some of that money was going to support terrorism.
Real quickly, and we got about 30 seconds here, though. Several administrations, as you have implied, have identified Iran as a state sponsor of terror, yet the president just finished a trip to Saudi Arabia, where private actors with connections, at least, have certainly been accused of funding terror. Now the president has lashed out against Qatar, where we have a major military base. If we focus just on Iran in our policy here, is the president simultaneously ignoring or possibly even making deals with other places from which terror funding comes?
I have never suggested that we should only focus on Iran. I believe that, look, the incredible and despicable attacks that happened in Manchester and London really speak and do whatever is necessary to combat terrorism, while at the same time making sure that we prevent the nuclearization of further nations.
Mr. Ossoff, we've got about 30 seconds for a response here.
Well, I just think that the facts matter, that we need a tough and firm policy on Iran, that if Iran violates its obligations, then we need to impose sanctions immediately, that if Iran continues to test ballistic missiles, we need to impose sanctions because they'd be violating UN Security Council resolutions. But Secretary Handel sees fit to put Iran back on the path to nuclear weapons capability by eliminating their obligations to avoid restricting uranium, and I don't agree with her on that.
Secretary Handel, about 30 seconds, and then we'll move on.
We can move on.
Okay.
He's just wrong.
Let's talk a little bit about something we mentioned a moment ago. And Secretary Handel, President Trump did not do very well in the primaries, the Republican primaries, in the 6th district, compared to not only previous presidential candidates on the GOP side, but he didn't win the district in the Georgia primary. Is that a signal that voters are looking for someone who will push back against the president when he, for instance, takes on the Russia investigation, or when he tweets and calls people names and whatever?
I realize that Democrats and even the media want to make this congressional race
I apologize
about
for interrupting you.
President
I've
Trump.
just been told we got about 1 minute here for
Okay,
each of you.
about President Trump. This race is not about the president. It is about who is most equipped and has the best experience and really aligns with the people of the 6th District to be their next congressman. Jon Ossoff, he says he lives 5 minutes outside of the district. Well, that might be true, but his values are 3,000 miles away in California. We need someone who has been part of this community, someone that people know. The people of the 6th District, they know my track record. They know what I have accomplished. They know that I am going to go there to be a voice for them and to fight for them. I have built my career on facing down and staring down the status quo. I have never been a go along to get along. That is not going to change. It is just who I am. I will have a singular mission to be the fiercest advocate for the people of the 6th District.
Mr. Ossoff, let me pursue that point for just a second because it's one that Secretary Handel has made in her campaign ads, or at least the Republicans have made in their campaign ads. Assuming you're elected, you're almost going to be immediately running for re-election. And you're going to need help from the Democratic leadership, which has been part of the help for your campaign. It's a natural thing in politics. They're going to say, look, we helped you, you need to help us. You've talked about being independent. How can you, when you may need their help against a well-funded Republican opponent in the next election, should you win?
Well, there is indeed a clear contrast in this race, as Secretary Handel said. I will be a fresh, independent voice for this district. Secretary Handel, on the other hand, is a career politician who's run 6 times for 5 different offices. The last 2 major responsibilities she had as Secretary of State, she quit the job early to seek higher office, as so many career politicians do. Her last major responsibility in the private sector at the Komen Foundation, she quit. She resigned in disgrace amidst a scandal over her leadership of an effort to defund life-saving breast cancer screenings at Planned Parenthood. And in 2012, Secretary Handel, you said, quote, "I embrace that I led the project," that project being to defund breast cancer screenings at Planned Parenthood. The last few weeks, you've avoided responsibility. I think you should take responsibility for what you did and explain to the people of the 6th District why you thought it was appropriate to impose your own views on women here in Georgia and across the state by defunding life-saving breast cancer screenings at Planned Parenthood.
Secretary Handel,
If I might. John, I know you're really stuck on this issue, so I'm really glad you brought it up again so that I can reiterate the facts. What was happening at Komen was not a defunding of screenings. It was a recognition that, number one, Planned Parenthood does not do mammograms. Those dollars were being realigned to provide direct services to women so that more women would have access to more mammograms. Number 2, and I realize you might not know this because you don't live in the 6th District. The 6th District does not have a single Planned Parenthood clinic. We do, however, have 4 community health centers, and these community health centers are the front door for a full range of health care for low-income women in our community. Around the state of Georgia, there are 4 Planned Parenthood clinics compared to 60 community health care centers. I have always been in the place of wanting more funding for women to have greater access to health screenings, and that's what I will fight for in
All right.
Congress.
I'm sorry, but there
About-
is a Planned Parenthood
about 15
clinic.
seconds
There is
here,
a
and then we
Planned
gotta move.
Parenthood clinic in Marietta that serves many residents of the 6th District.
It's not in the
and you
6th
said-
District.
And you said in 2012, quote, "I embrace that I led the project to defund breast cancer screenings." Now you avoid responsibility. Which is the truth?
John, once again, you continue and have throughout this entire campaign misled individuals with false and deceptive comments.
It's a simple question, with all due respect.
With all due respect, do not interrupt me. When I was in my role at Komen, the objective was to find a way to have more money to go to mammograms so that we were able to get greater benefit out of very limited dollars. Planned Parenthood does not do mammograms. And John and Democrats saying that over and over again does not make it true.
Mr. Ossoff, real quickly, you got about 15 seconds here.
Well, in 2012, Secretary Handel said, "I led the project to defund breast cancer screenings at Planned Parenthood." And Planned Parenthood provides hundreds of thousands of breast cancer screenings per year. And now Secretary Handel has said that she didn't lead the effort. So she was either telling the truth then, or she's telling the truth now.
We're going to move on, and on Planned Parenthood, though, so bear with me. We've got a couple of fact checks here that might please both sides, make both sides less than happy. Planned Parenthood, according to the fact checkers at the Washington Post, does in fact not provide mammograms. It does do physical exams. So the claim from Secretary Handel that it does not provide mammograms was rated true. And Mr. Ossoff's claim that Ms. Handel had said she had led the efforts to defund breast cancer screenings was rated mostly true by PolitiFact. So those are the.
Well, if I might, Dennis.
Well, let me get to.
Well, this is really, you've allowed him to have the last word every single time.
No.
So, if I might, there is a very big difference for me to do my job at Komen, and that is what I did. I led the effort to find a way to have those dollars that were going to an organization that did not even provide mammograms, cannot legally provide mammograms, be reinvested. There was no decrease in funding for it at all. In fact, more women were going to be able to get mammograms because those dollars are going to go directly to the service providers.
Okay,
That's a
let's-
very different
Dennis, there are
statement than is being presented.
two very important points here, Dennis.
Let me just move
Two
on to
very
something because
important
I think you'll have a chance to
Sure.
get in what you're trying to say in response to this question, okay? And Secretary Handel, I'm going to start with you because the President's fiscal 2018 budget defunds Planned Parenthood because we're going from the past to now with Planned Parenthood. The House passed the bill and also passed a bill to temporarily block Planned Parenthood from receiving Medicaid funds, but none of the federal money goes to abortions. You mentioned community centers. You are chair of the Fulton County Commission. You know the state of Fulton County's health department sometimes. Do you think that community centers could really take up the slack all around the country if Planned Parenthood were defunded?
Well, first of all, again, Planned Parenthood is not the front door of women's health, not here in the 6th District, not in the state of Georgia, and not around the country. So it is imperative for community health centers to be able to pick up the slack. And I support more funding for these community health centers because in the state of Georgia, there are 4 Planned Parenthood clinics, while there are 60 community health centers, and they are located strategically around this state where low-income women can have access. Think about a poor woman who lives, let's just say, in South Georgia. The closest in Long County, the closest Planned Parenthood clinic for that woman is going to be in Macon or Savannah. She doesn't maybe even have a car, let alone the gas
So,
money to get there. So we need to build up the infrastructure as well as the resources and the talent within our community health centers because they are the front door for low-income women for a full range of health care.
Mr. Ossoff, obviously you wanted to make a point about
Yeah.
what had happened previously, but that was what was, and we're already into our domestic issues section,
Well,
in case
Dennis.
you may have guessed.
Dennis, the physical breast cancer screenings that Planned Parenthood provides are recommended as a key diagnostic technique by the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. My fiance's mother survived breast cancer because it was caught early. And there are millions of women who survived breast cancer because it was caught early. And that's why this is so important, because Secretary Handel took a job at a charity whose purpose was to fight breast cancer. And she brought in her own agenda. She led the effort to defund life-saving breast cancer screenings at Planned Parenthood, and it cost the Komen Foundation tens of millions of dollars or more in lost revenues. It did significant damage to their life-saving mission.
Secretary Handel, 15 seconds, and then we have to move on.
What I supported then and support now is making sure that dollars go where women can really get mammograms. Planned Parenthood does not do mammograms. Planned Parenthood in Georgia, there are 4. So if you are a low-income woman and you are looking for the full range of health care, you're not traveling 3-4 hours to get to a Planned Parenthood clinic. You're going to the community health center that's right there in your community, and I support more funding for that, and we'll fight for that.
Moving on to the environment. And this comes from a question that we got from our audience. They want to know from both of you, and Mr. Ossoff, I'm going to start with you. If elected, will you represent the majority of your district, this according to the member of our audience, and stand up to President Trump on climate change because he recently decided to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement and is rolling back Obama-era climate plans? But the Paris Climate Accord is voluntary, So there's no guarantee that it by itself would produce effects that might not happen otherwise. You probably know quite well that here in Georgia, Georgia Power is phasing out coal plants, even with or without the Clean Power Plan that the president is scrapping. So isn't there enough happening in the United States, and particularly here in Georgia, with or without the Paris Accord?
Well, Dennis, here's who agrees that climate change is a major threat to our prosperity and to our security: the military, the intelligence community, and peer-reviewed science. And if that's not enough for you, then your head is buried pretty deep in the sand. When the military, the intelligence community, and peer-reviewed science all agree, then policymakers need to take that seriously. And in Paris, for the first time, China and India, two major emitters, as well as two major economic competitors of the United States, also committed to significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And rather than letting them off the hook, we need to take a tough stance that holds China and India accountable to living up to their obligations. And the U.S. should continue to exercise global leadership in the fight against climate change.
Secretary Handel.
The Paris Accord was a very bad deal for America and Americans. It is important that we do the right thing, but we also do the right thing in the right way. In that accord, first of all, there is no ability within the accord to hold India or China accountable, none whatsoever. And American businesses were being put at a significant competitive disadvantage. So what the president has said is he wants to renegotiate it and come back to the table and make it a fair agreement where there is accountability within that agreement.
Let me ask you a quick follow-up here, and we'll go to Mr. Ossoff as well. The Paris Agreement, though, is based on what is a pretty widely accepted and vast body of evidence, scientific evidence, that human activity contributes to climate change, at least. So what response would you like to see to climate change? And you can start by answering whether you think human activity contributes to it.
Look, I think that clearly there have been changes in the climate. I'm not a scientist, so I read all of that and take it all in. What I am set on is making sure that we do the right thing in the right way. We all, I don't think a single person in this room, regardless of their political persuasion, disagrees with the fact that we must be responsible stewards of our environment. But let's do that in the right way and not cripple American businesses and put us at a complete disadvantage with a fluffy agreement that had absolutely no ability to hold any other nations accountable.
All right. Mr. Ossoff?
Sure. Well, neither of us are scientists. That's why we have scientists. And 97% of scientists, as well as the military and the intelligence community, agree that climate change is a threat to our security and prosperity, and that it's driven in part by human activity. And Secretary Handel didn't actually answer the question. And I would give her an opportunity to do it again. Do you believe 97% of scientists, the overwhelming consensus of the scientific community, that climate change is a significant threat and that it's driven in part by human activity?
John, I would like to ask you this. Do you believe that American businesses should be held at a competitive disadvantage?
No, I think that we need to hold China and India accountable to the unprecedented
And it's not possible in that
commitments
agreement,
that they
which
made.
is why the
Hold on.
president wants to renegotiate.
Let him finish, and then you can talk. Go ahead. Mr. Ossoff?
I will answer the question, and the answer is no. I believe that we need to hold China and India accountable to the significant and unprecedented commitments that they made and continue to exercise U.S. global leadership on this issue. And now, with all due respect, Secretary Handel, I would give you an opportunity to answer my question, which is, do you agree that climate change is a significant threat and that it's driven by human activity?
I apologize for cutting you off. We're running up against time.
Again, I think that we have to do the right thing. Everyone agrees that we have to be responsible stewards of our environment, but let's do the right thing in the right way. This agreement was not it. There is no ability to hold anyone accountable, and our American business should not have been put at a competitive disadvantage.
Right. It's now time for our closing statements. Once again, there were a whole bunch of things we could have gotten to, but we thank both of you for giving us this time. And again, by coin toss, Mr. Ossoff, who is the Democrat running for the 6th Congressional District, has the first closing statement. You have 2 minutes.
Well, thank you again, Dennis. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thanks to the audience for being here. As I mentioned in my opening statement, Metro Atlanta's economic potential is huge. And I want to see us achieve that potential. I want to see us grow into the thriving commercial capital that we can become. And I believe to do that, we need to exercise fresh, independent leadership that listens to science that works across the aisle, that is fact-based, and that is committed to getting things done. That is the fresh, independent perspective we need with all of the gridlock and disarray in Washington right now. We need independent-minded leadership. And Secretary Handel will likely devote her final 2 minutes to partisan attacks. Instead, I'm going to focus on what we can do to growing our local economy. We need to attack wasteful spending. I've identified $600 billion in cuts and savings over 10 years so that we can attack the deficit, so that we can set the right priorities, high-tech research, biotech research, infrastructure, higher education, that we need to move this economy forward. We have some of the brightest young people in the world coming out of our public colleges and universities with degrees in science, technology, engineering, and math. We need to make sure they can apply their talents here in our technology sector. We need to make sure that Metro Atlanta becomes an economic powerhouse that's the envy of the rest of the country. And if we're going to do that, we need less partisanship. We need less careerism in politics. We need fresh leadership focused on getting things done.
Thank you, Mr. Ossoff.
Thank you.
Secretary Handel.
Thank you very much, Dennis, and John, thanks for being here as well. In this election, the voters of the 6th District have a real choice between the real Karen Handel and the deceptive fake John Ossoff. I have brought tremendous experience and have tremendous tentacles and commitment to this community. I've spent nearly 25 years in the 6th District. My opponent, he talks about what he's going to do, and it may all sound good, but I have actually done it. As in the private sector, as Fulton County Commission Chairman, I was able to balance that budget without tax increases. As Secretary of State, I cut the budget by 20%. As CEO of the North Fulton Chamber of Commerce, I led economic development programs that helped to create tens of thousands of jobs in North Metro Atlanta. You know my record. You know that I have a great determination to get the job done. What we need most is experience in this role. Not a lot of talk, not someone who has a career staffer as his background for one of the most liberal members of Congress, an individual who inflated that resume. We need someone who is going to go to Washington, hit the ground running for you, someone who is tested, someone who is proven. You have a real choice in this election. The Karen Handel that you know, the Karen Handel who has always stood by you, stood up for you, and has never been afraid to challenge the status quo. I asked for your vote in this election, but now I'm going to work very, very hard to earn it.
Thank you, Secretary Handel. And that concludes Georgia's 6th Congressional District debate from the studios of PBA 30 and 90.1 WABE. Many thanks to our studio audience who remained quiet during the conversation. And as we thank our candidates, Republican Karen Handel and Democrat John Ossoff, along with the staff and management of Public Broadcasting Atlanta, you have your chance to express your appreciation to our candidates. Thank you all so much. Have a great day.